Tenai, USDA Pro Cashew, Intersnack, and many others. Before I hand over to Jim, please note that this session is being held in English with a simultaneous French interpretation. To access this service, kindly click on the globe icon on your screen. Select a preferred language and mute the original sound. Should you have any question or need for clarification as the presentation is ongoing, we ask that you use the Q&A feature, and after the presentation, Jim will address all your concerns. Without wasting much time again, I'd like to hand over to Jim to take us through today's session. Jim, good morning.
Good morning, Blessing. Thanks very much. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Hope you too.
Yeah, I'm pretty good. I'd like to welcome everyone joining us again. I can't believe it's the 48th session that we're having, but I'm looking forward to it. I was at the World Cashew Conference recently, and I was talking to a lot of people, and we got a lot of thoughts. And I saw this quote in a newspaper here in Ireland. At no time in the last 4 years has there been more confusion, more mixed signals about the future direction of the global economy. And I thought, well, that's a bit like cashews, isn't it? It is, as someone said to me recently, perfectly balanced. And I thought about it and I thought, actually, maybe it's perfectly unbalanced. So I thought, let's talk about some of these issues. So the market has really never been more difficult to read than right now in March 2023. So if you feel confused or indecisive, join the club, because almost everyone does. So today we're going to look at some of those factors that are causing this perfect imbalance, as I've termed it. And we're going to try to get to the bottom of some of the issues that have brought us to this point. So we'll start with a production update, some news from various producing countries, and then we'll talk about these mixed messages or the apparent contradictions in the cashew market. And then at the end, there'll be plenty of time for questions and answers. So if you want to ask a question, if you want to contribute, if you want to disagree, particularly if you want to disagree, feel free to either type a question into the questions and answers box or raise your hand and come online and we'll have a chat about whatever's on your mind, and maybe we could get to the bottom of these issues. So let's start with a look at production. And we probably should remind ourselves before we do that of the spread of production around the world, how Africa remains in 2023 the major production region, especially West Africa, with almost half of the world's cashews grown there. But we should also remind ourselves that Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Vietnam, to a lesser extent, Thailand and Burma have become really significant in terms of their production. So now with the growth of Cambodia, about 25% of the world's cashews are grown in that region, most of those in Cambodia, of course. And India maintains its position, and East Africa, despite a not too great season in Tanzania, maintains its position around 9%. So that's where cashews are grown. So let's have a look at some of the news, and we'll start in Asia, the big processing countries and what they're reporting. So in Vietnam, lower than expected crop based on the initial estimates. Quality and quantity is likely to be lower. Now, that doesn't mean a huge amount for overall global production, because Vietnam is somewhere between 7 and 8% of world production. So a slight fall in Vietnam doesn't make an awful lot of difference to the overall picture. But what we are seeing in Vietnam right now is lower quality product, mostly due to rain damage, and lower prices as a result. If we look in Cambodia, which really is the driver of production growth in recent years, the estimates now still quite a wide range, from 800,000 to 1 million tons, but that's well up from the 700,000 tons of last year. If we look at prices in Cambodia, quite high at the moment. The last price I heard was $1,300 at the farm gate, undried. Most of the Cambodian cashews are sold to Vietnam undried and then dried when they arrive in Vietnam. Prices then are lower than last year. In fact, pricing at the farm gate in Cambodia has been quite volatile in recent years, and that may be part of the reason for the decline in the hectares. Now, Cambodia is really interesting. We've seen Cambodia grow dramatically over the last 4 years, mainly based on new high-yielding varieties. But we also noting that some of those varieties are quite vulnerable to poor growing conditions and quite vulnerable to pests and diseases. And that means that farmers in Cambodia need to work hard, invest in their trees, spend a lot of money on inputs, giving them a different cost profile to, let's say, similar farmers in West Africa. Now, in return for that, they're getting very high yields, but there must be questions in the longer term as to where some of the Cambodian trees are planted and whether that makes sense, and how many of them have been planted. So we may well see in the coming years Cambodian production stabilize around the current levels. If we look at India, well, speaking of stability, Indian cashew production has been relatively stable for a number of years. The initial forecasts are unchanged from last year. We're still looking at very slow growth, although friends in India tell me that we might see faster growth in Indian production from next year. Certainly there have been a lot of efforts made to try and improve production. So we're coming to the end of a period when production in India has migrated from the very southern part of the country to a much wider area of production. And now we may well see production start to grow again. But I don't think we're going to see anything like we saw in Cambodia or we saw in Cote d'Ivoire 10 years ago. So the impact of the situation in Asian producing countries is probably an increase of somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 tons. That's balancing a poor enough crop in Vietnam with a much better crop in Cambodia. Probably, I think it's wavering toward the higher figure there. So that would mean depending again on which estimate you take, somewhere between 2 and 6% increase of the global crop. If I had to pick a number, I would say that probably you're looking at 4% right in the middle of those two figures. Have to have a quick look at the demand and inventory of RCN in Asia. This is critical at this time of year, has a big impact on how the sales of raw cashew nuts from West Africa will go. So if we look in Vietnam, you see big numbers, you see 200,000 tons as a stock figure. It sounds like a big number, but it is only about 1.25 months processing stock. I suspect that forward sales are much lighter now. The fall off in demand in the US market and slower European market mean that there are fewer forward sales than you would normally have expected. So remember that at this time of the year, normally Vietnamese processors would have heavy forward sales and they would buy buying raw cashew nuts to meet those sales. That's probably a little bit less the case this year, but they have been importing. So in the first 6 weeks of the year to the 15th of February, Vietnam Customs reports very strong imports, up by 73% on last year, which if nothing else shows a degree of confidence. But exports are down 10% even on last year. Now, let's not overemphasize that because it was not until later in the year in 2022 that we saw exports affected. Actually, January, early February last year was quite good. So 10% down is not necessarily an indicator of what's to come. Looking in India, demand appears to continue strong. The inventory of the 2022 crop of RCN is selling. Imports look to remain pretty strong. Indicators from various sources in India suggest that the market is likely to continue to grow. An analytical agency suggests another year of about 15% growth in India. I must say that would be remarkable, but it's possible. Either way, I think we're going to see fairly strong imports of raw cashew nuts into India. I don't think this year we will see a return to growth in exports from India. Exports of kernels from India have been falling for many years. I think probably the root of that is about 15 years ago. But we may well see India return a little bit to the export market toward the end of the year and into 2024. Again, I don't think enough to disrupt the current market pattern. Looking at Cambodia, well, much better crop. They don't carry inventory in Cambodia. Everything is sold out. Some processing. There are some factories in operation, but it still looks as if 95% of the raw cashew nuts go to Vietnam this year. Interestingly, some Indian buyers of raw cashew nuts have been expressing interest in buying in Cambodia. Some have visited. There have been over the years light imports, but we're talking very light. We're talking in the hundreds of tons from India, from Cambodia into India. There's no reason why that shouldn't continue, but it would be interesting to see how Indian processors would appreciate the quality of Cambodian raw cashew nuts. So let's just focus in then on Africa as a region. And the driver of production in Africa is the largest producer of cashew nuts in the world, Cote d'Ivoire. Forecast this year around about 1.1 million tons. Reports from the first flush, from the first crop, not so good. So reports that rainfall may have damaged flowering and that this may be a little bit less. Now, we have seen that before, and it hasn't actually impacted the overall volume, but it is something to be followed. Farm gate prices are high at the moment. There are stocks from 2022, but I don't think they're problematic. Elsewhere in West Africa, most countries, Nigeria, Benin, Ghana, Togo, Guinea, I had an opportunity to speak to people from all of those countries recently, all reporting good crops. Guinea-Bissau, we saw some good reporting during the World Cashew Conference, and it looks like a good crop in Guinea-Bissau, but there are some unsold stocks there, I think possibly currently under negotiation. So overall in West Africa, we see a situation where I think the stocks are probably less. The 2022 crop carry in is probably less than it might have been expected because of the good support from India for imports in the latter part of 2022, reducing stocks, particularly in countries like Guinea. There are stocks, Guinea-Bissau estimated around 50,000 tons. That's quite a lot. Cote d'Ivoire, somewhere between 60 and 85,000 tons. Now that's anecdotal reports. That's not really a lot in the sense that it's less than a month's usage between exports and processing in the country. So although you may see some mixing of all crop stocks in Cote d'Ivoire, that should exhaust itself fairly quickly. Overall production higher than last year, I think, in West Africa by 5 to 7%, but we should always in March be a little bit cautious because the initial forecasts are often overly optimistic. So we often get forecasts from growers, forecasts from traders and governments particularly, where they tend to overestimate the crop for that season for lots of different reasons. Overall, where does that leave us on production in the world, according to me? Well, I think we're going to have a record crop. I think we're going to have a crop that is, again, better than last year, better than 2021. And all of this volatility in recent years has really been down to the volatility in Cambodia. So in 2020 to 21, the huge increase, from 21 to 22, then a decline in the crop in Cambodia and an improvement then again. So whereas 5 years ago, we would very much have been saying that West Africa was the driver of volatility in production, I think we can now say that it's really Cambodia that's doing that. Now, overall, that probably means production for this year up somewhere between 5 and 7%. quite a healthy situation. Production continues to grow, but I think we do need to bear in mind that with Cambodia having risen so quickly, and with questions over many of the areas in Cambodia that were planted to cashews, and with the ability of Cambodian farmers to change when they see the opportunity or the need, and the high cost of inputs, we have to be very careful before we just assume that production will continue in this pattern. As we've seen, and we saw this from 2017, 18, 19, when production growth was driven by West Africa, it was relatively stable. So the days of fast growth in West Africa appear to be gone for now. There are significant opportunities for growth in Nigeria, in Benin, in Ghana particularly. But for now, we're looking at Cambodia as the driver, and therefore we're looking at a relatively high-risk situation in terms of growth slowing or growth being lost in the coming years. But for this year, it looks like a good crop, 5 to 7% up on last year. That'll make it a record crop. So moving away from production, then we're going to talk about some of these, what I'm calling mixed messages and mismatches. So these are some of the factors in the market that we're all fairly familiar with at this point, but that nonetheless continue to bemuse many of us. So things like the fact that raw cashew nut prices in the international market don't tally with cashew kernel prices, that farm gate prices, particularly in West Africa at the moment in some areas, don't match the export prices for raw cashew nuts, that lower prices generally in the market, lower prices for kernels, have not been affected, have not managed to increase demand. So it appears to be against the basic law of economics. Lower prices and falling demand at the same time, and we'll have a chat about that. And then something that's, I must say, surprising to me, but it is a fact, that the demands, sustainability demands of buyers are not being reflected in the prices paid by those buyers. We'll ask the question, are buyers actually serious about sustainability? Let's start with the first of our mixed messages and mismatches, and that is the situation with regard to raw cashew nuts and cashew kernel prices. So what we have here are 5 examples, and they are examples, right? So this is not perfect. This is an indication. This is different for every factory. But if we look at it and take some general examples, so using Ivorian raw cashew nuts, I just priced them in at $12.50. Cambodian raw cashew nuts at $1,300 at the farm gate. I've taken Vietnamese processing costs at $150 a ton, so we're only talking about efficient factories. And in Cote d'Ivoire, I took $4.50, which is probably, some are better than that, some are worse, but it's a much more general representation of costs there. And if we look at that, we see the put together price of 320s in the bars. So for example, the blue one is Vietnamese processing of Cambodian raw material. The red is Vietnamese processing of Ivorian raw material, Indian domestic material, India processing Ghanaian raw material, and a very efficient factory in Cote d'Ivoire processing locally. And what we see is that the current value of 320s, represented by this dotted line, is very close to cost. And this is the conundrum, that how can the market function when the cost of the product put together, either from locally closely imported raw cashew nuts or from raw cashew nuts imported from half a world away, we see this problem of cost and market, and that makes margins for processors extremely tight. The Indian situation is a little bit different. We see that the costs are a little bit lower compared to the market price in India. Prices in India are higher. The market is a protected market. Indian processors appear as if they can make money, and I think some of them can, but at the same time, when you look at it, it's a pretty tight calculation. I mean, you really wouldn't invest in processing today based simply on that calculation. If we look in Cote d'Ivoire and take probably an optimum example, we see that, yeah, origin processing in that case can be profitable. Now, bear in mind that this calculation is only for cashew kernels. It doesn't take into account any benefits of the sale of byproducts. So Vietnamese processors have been benefiting from the sale of byproducts over the last couple of years. In contrast, Ivorian processors have not. So it's an indication, but I think it's reasonable to say that we're not seeing a situation where processing is attractive in the way that you might say that I could buy raw cashew nuts today, process them, and sell the kernels at a profit. And that's a measure of risk, and it's a measure of efficiency, and it's a measure of the sustainability of the current market situation. How long has this been in place? Well, if we go back to March 2022, it was actually a pretty similar calculation. So on the left-hand side, you can see a calculation from March 2022, which I presented on this GME, and it's not that dissimilar this year. So that means that profitability in processing, particularly in Vietnam, has been poor, or for some non-existent for more than a year. From Vietnam, we hear processors, importers telling us that the answer is lower RCN, that raw cashew nuts should be lower by perhaps $200, $250 a ton. And you can see their point when you look at the calculation. But on the other hand, we see Indian buyers being able to buy imported raw cashew nuts and make a profit. And that's not going to change. So we have this situation where we've two gigantic processing countries, one for re-export, Vietnam, one for domestic consumption primarily. One can pay a much higher price than the other and still be profitable. And that is one of the significant mismatches in this market. It's not simply about lower RCN prices. So we could ask the question, are kernels underpriced? And then we'd say, well, okay, kernels are at 10-year lows. Is that underpriced? Or we can say, is RCN overpriced? And then raw cashew nuts are trading around about 5-year averages. So they're not particularly high, they're certainly not low. So this gets us into a really difficult situation. And the obvious answer would be, well, kernels are way too low at 10-year lows. It doesn't make sense. But let's have a look and see how this situation arose. So here we have the trend since July 2019, FOB WW320 cashew kernels from top processors, mainly based on Vietnamese processors. So we're talking here about minimum BRC processor, reliable processor. And we just look at the trend. So back, COVID arrives and we get this decline in price. Meantime, throughout that period, 2020, 2021, into the beginning of 2022, we very, very strong demand in the European Union and in the US, remarkably strong demand. Then comes a period last year from February, and not just from February, because this started before, where we had the war in Ukraine, advent of fast inflation, and a lot of economic uncertainty. Prices continued their downward spiral, and the interesting point is continued. And at different points in that period, there were little periods of panic on price. Markets dropping down, people selling at $2.40 for 320s, for example. US demand was poor. China was in and out of the market. China is about 9% of the world demand, but is important for Vietnam, particularly seasonal demand. But we noticed that the decline in price started before the war, before inflation started to kick in. The decline in price started around about September 2021, having built a significant recovery after the COVID panic. Prices then started to fall in Vietnam, And that really is the root of the problem, that period there, because prices were low when we got the impact of inflation and economic uncertainty. And if we look at that, we think that dropping prices, which I think was a deliberate decision, dropping prices during that period did not reverse the trend in demand, because it was not about price at that time. It was not a case where a lower price would stimulate demand. And I think there's a number of factors here. I think perhaps processors didn't know their customers very well, that they didn't recognize that the 2020-21 first quarter 2022 boom had to come to an end at some price. So looking at this and thinking, this is how we got to a position where at one point WW320s hit $2.40, the lowest price since 2008, I think. They're now recovered somewhat, but you would still have to come to the conclusion that although RCN short term might be a little bit overpriced, that the fundamental issue here is that cashew kernels are underpriced. And that is actually self-inflicted to a large extent. But it will take time to heal. On the one hand, RCN will be supported by continued strong demand in India. Buyers will buy. You know, how do you stop the market from going up? Stop buying. But you can't stop buying when you've got demand and you want to process and you're in business. On the other hand, it'll take some time for buyers in Western countries, in Europe and the United States to react to prices. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. So this mismatch looks set to continue, but I would still maintain that the kernels are underpriced, and that's where the greatest possibility of some volatility, which also means risk, in the coming 12 months. Let's have a look at some of the farm gate prices. So this is the second mismatch, farm gate prices and export prices for RCN, and I'm a little bit less sure on this one, I have to say. Because farm gate prices in Cote d'Ivoire, for example, tell us a different story. They would tell us that actually RCN is overpriced when you look at it right now. Because if we look at this chart, so here we have in dollars converted from CFA, farm gate minimum price, the actual farm gate price reported at the moment, the delivered price to factories, the export costs, and an estimation of profit margins for export traders. And that would give us a total cost around about $1,000, but offered prices range up as high as $1,200. Now they are offered prices rather than traded prices, but you would see there is something of a mismatch here between the farm gate price. So right now, people telling us that farm gate prices in Cote d'Ivoire are too high for export RCN might be contradicted by looking at the values in the marketplace. And therefore, we may see a slight retracement in the offered prices for raw cashew nuts in the short term. That assumes, of course, that the crop in Cote d'Ivoire continues to be a good crop. Any disruption to supply, any crop problem, any bad weather would change that calculation. So the second of our mismatches doesn't really appear to be a mismatch, it just appears to be a short-term marketed phenomenon. What isn't short-term and what has been going on for some time is the third mismatch, where we're looking at lower prices and at the same time falling demand. So we ask the question, why is demand in the US and the European Union not responding to lower prices? Let's again have a look at the situation as it arose. So throughout January 2020 until April 2022, we saw the import boom for cashew kernels in Western markets, particularly in the US, but also in the European Union. By September 2021, we started to see a sustained fall in prices. By the second quarter of 2022, buying had completely fallen away. Prices started to drop. We started to see these 10-year lows. We had tested them in late 2021, but a return to those again in the second quarter of 2022. And From July onwards, imports, so that means shipments probably starting in May, into the United States, into the European Union, into Canada had started to fall away. And the fall in the US was quite dramatic. 19% down on the full year last year, but 35% down in certain individual months in the second half of the year. Europe, again, quite significant falls year on year, but over the year, we're waiting for the final figures, probably down by 3 to 4%, not overly significant. But if we look at the second half of the year, there was a sharp fall away. So when we saw this import boom, let's have a look at how did the market react? What happened? So strangely, at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, processors, export processors, reacted by dropping prices. That was based on fear. It was highly influenced by the situation in China, and it was based on the fear that there would be a demand crash. Of course, that didn't happen. What happened was that there was an absolute boom in imports into markets in the West, a kind of staccato response in China, responding to lockdowns. It would be open, then it would be closed. Demand in India, of course, slipped back, highly affected by the restrictions around the pandemic. By the time we get to the end of this period of import boom, the expectation for continued high volumes amongst importers and amongst roasters was there. Inventories were high in anticipation of further disruption to shipment. But as that faded away more quickly than people expected, inventories started to rise. Then we got impacted by the fear of economic slowdown. Buying was halted, not initially because demand at the supermarket level was down, but because companies looked at costs, they looked at supply chain. In the boardroom, they decided, we're not going to take any risk on this. And I think there was an impact of cashews being lumped together with all of the tree nuts. General decisions were made. Demand starts to slow down. At that point, prices, because we'd set prices quite low at the beginning of the pandemic, they never fully recovered. They started to slide again in September 21. Imports are now falling, despite the market at 10-year lows. So imports in reaction are different. Some buyers started to delay their contracts, causing a lot of trouble. Some buyers, unfortunately, defaulted on their contracts. And in the end, last November, incredibly, US supermarkets actually increased the prices at retail, due, they say, to other costs. So what we see was a really bad signal in dropping prices fairly illogically twice, once at the beginning of the pandemic. Secondly, in September 21, this sent a really strong signal that lower prices are available and that something is wrong, essentially. And so during a period of low prices, we see the largest ever decline in imports over a 6-month period. Let's have a look at the reasons then. So first of all, most simply, most obviously, it takes time for demand to react after a drop in price. Now, normally, a reaction, like in 2017, we saw a slowdown following high prices. This is completely different. This is not just based on the price of cashew nuts. This is based on a whole range of other factors. It's not even based simply on an economic turndown. As we saw in 2008-9, we saw about 4 months of a decline in imports based on economic circumstances, and that turned into quite steady growth the following year. Now we're seeing a whole host of factors, and just like I said at the beginning, in the general economic picture, it's never been less clear than it is at the moment. But there are other factors. There are factors that might have corrected this situation. And I think this one of the big issues, in my opinion, is that processors, exporters, importers sent all the wrong signals. And I think they did that. I put down KYC, that's know your customer. And I don't think we do. I don't think we spend time trying to understand what our customers want. I don't think we spend time trying to understand how their businesses work. So when we drop prices, particularly Vietnamese processors, we should bear in mind that roasters or supermarkets are not traders. They buy and then they stop. They don't buy more because it's cheaper. They're not speculators. Secondly, if we lower prices after our customers have bought, it makes the buyer, the individual buyer, look bad in their own company. And it makes them more cautious, and it makes them less likely to take advantage of the next low price opportunity. Lower prices reduce the value of inventory. So if inventory is high and prices are falling, it's not just the next purchase that's impacted, it's everything that's in the warehouse. And that can create a lot of problems, especially for importers. Lower prices, particularly the kind of sharp, illogical fall that we've seen, create a situation where one roaster can undercut another roaster, again undermining confidence. Overall, in this situation, good, reliable buyers tend to feel frustrated. And the bad buyers, or the more risky buyers, well, they just default on their contracts. And that's what we've seen. So my view on this is that dropping prices from $3, first at the beginning of the pandemic and secondly later, was unnecessary, that it wasn't actually driven by demand at that time. It was a knee-jerk reaction to a notional set of circumstances. Prices dropped in a demand boom, but the signal sent was that prices should be low, that prices can be low. Supermarkets, roasters, they don't know if you're losing money or not as a processor. And by the looks of it, they don't care. So we've sent a lot of poor signals. Now we're in a different situation now. Inventories are lower. Inflation is receding slowly, or it's expected to recede. Costs are normalizing a little. Freight has come down a long way. Anyone in the raw cashew nut business will know that. Energy prices are at last falling. So people are still, consumers in Western countries particularly, are noticing that they're still getting very high bills for their electricity or their gas, but that these bills are going to be lower next month, lower the following month. So we're in a different situation now. So when we look at the market as it stands, we see we're probably in a situation of, let's call it, fewer unknowns. And buyers are seeing mixed signals. So they're seeing the crops are good, no denying that, but RCN prices are higher than kernels. That's the mismatch we started this conversation with. We see that low kernels prices persist from processors. You can go out there today and you can buy 260, 265 for WW320s. Now, I'm not saying that's from the ideal supplier, but the price is available. And if you just, if you're a buyer who doesn't buy directly from the origin, you just read the emails every day and you look at the prices, you probably don't know the difference between a top processor and a processor that probably should be at a lower price. So they see lower prices persisting. We know that forward cover is relatively low, which is typical of this situation. I wonder how low forward cover is. I suspect it's as low as it's ever been at this time of year. And we see some importers offering very low prices for forward shipments. And I'm struggling to understand that too. Prices based on current FOB prices. We're seeing that processors generally do not know their customers' needs. Now that may be because they sell indirectly through an importer or a broker. It may be because they still think like commodity traders that they're trading a product, not a service, not a resolution of a problem for their buyer. And they're also seeing now the chances that Vietnam will compete with its customers. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is by going into processed products, going into roasted packed consumer packs, which is ambitious and which is an interesting strategy. and maybe a highly successful strategy in time. But the message the customer receives is that my supplier is going to compete with me, that they will be perhaps able to do it cheaper, and then I will lose some of my business as a result. So within these 7 factors, let's just take from the African processor's point of view, and let's think, as an African processor, do you know what your customer needs? Do you know how their market works? Are you actually talking to them about that? Are you assessing how you can do business, what problem you solve for them? Or are you getting embroiled in all of these 7 factors, the mismatches and the contradictions? So if your customer is telling you, well, I can buy cheaper in Vietnam, and that's the end of the conversation, then you need to talk more about what the customer needs, and particularly, is that the right customer that I'm trying to deal with? But there are opportunities. So one of the main opportunities that we saw, or thought we saw, was our next mixed message. And that was the case of sustainability. Sustainability, important for buyers, especially important for buyers in Western countries, especially important now that the law has started to change for care of the environment, care of workers and suppliers in the chain, factors such as traceability. And if we look at some of the factors, so if we look at the increase in processing in Africa, both by volume and the increase in processing by percentage of the crop, it would seem to indicate yes. This is from this slide is called the African Processing Revolution. We're going to talk about that during the next GME. So certainly there is an increase, and we know that in 2022, African cashew kernels, for the first time since the 1970s, went into double-digit share of the European market, which is a remarkable change. But on the other hand, if we take a look at this, so this is the US share of the market by Vietnamese cashew processors, who we know are the lowest cost in the world. And the high level, 89%, hovering between 89 and 90% in recent years and growing before that. This says, clear message you would have thought from the US market that, guys, price is more important to us than sustainability. Because as we know, Vietnamese processing is based on over 2 million tons of imports on average in recent years. And finally, if we look at some of the launches of product, one is from the US, one is from the UK, I believe. But this doesn't say anything good about sustainability at all. In fact, I think it says we don't care. Vietnamese cashew kernels, labeled as Vietnamese cashew kernels, Vietnamese jumbo roasted cashews, jumbo wrapped cashews, excuse me. These are almost certainly from Africa, and these are almost certainly from Cambodia. So what does that say about the belief in sustainability of buyers in Western countries? Now, it's not all buyers, but it is creating a frustration for African processors that find that buyers are interested in their USPs, their unique selling propositions, their sustainability, but they're not prepared to pay for it. And this is strange because it's often the buyers who talk most about sustainability who are the most difficult when it comes to price negotiation. And therefore, we have to address a question to African processors. Are you actually talking to the right customers? I think that's really an essential question when we look at competitive advantages of African processing: sustainability, USPs, traceability, responsibility, all of those factors. Are you talking to the right customers? If you're finding that you're getting all of these things thrown back at you, maybe you're talking to the wrong customer. So let's have a look then at our 4 mismatches and just think about them and summarize on them a little bit. So cashew kernel prices and RCN prices mismatching. And really what we're seeing is we're seeing strong Indian demand, poor marketing of kernels. And that's what I'm getting at when I talk about a logical reduction in price, not knowing your customer. That's about poor marketing. That's about not really understanding what makes your customer tick. And then the interest of traders, whose interest naturally, and they perform an important function, the interest of traders is to get between the two and to try and make money out of it. And we need them to do that, because until we have high levels of processing in West African countries, we need an RCN market and we need someone to handle that. So right now what we see is in Vietnam, I feel processors getting squeezed. They're getting squeezed between the high demand in India and poor marketing of kernels, which has led to these low prices. Roasting, value addition, consumer packs is not going to solve this problem. It's being presented as the answer. But it isn't actually the answer, because roasting, consumer packs, export to high value markets is even more demanding in terms of its marketing, food safety. So if you're unable to market a raw cashew nut, an unroasted cashew nut, a cashew kernel, well, what makes you think you're going to be able to handle the food safety requirements, the quality requirements, the marketing requirements for a roasted packed product? So actually what we're seeing here is a strain between the decommoditization of kernels and the commodity trading culture in the RCN business. That will only change when origin processing grows and starts to dominate the market. Second factor, well, I don't think that this farm gate price versus export prices for raw nuts is a mismatch. I think what we're seeing is we're seeing some early season spikes in prices, which we often see. They might be a little bit more exaggerated this year, whilst Indian buyers try to work out what's happening in Benin. Indian buyers love Benin RCN. It's coming to market a little bit later this year, and the situation is unclear, as there is on the horizon for 2024 a ban on the export of raw cashew nuts from Benin. If we look at our question about lower prices and falling demand, isn't it normal in economics that lower prices mean more demand? Well, they do, but we're in a very specific set of circumstances right now. So we need to look at the calendar, and we need to think about time, and we need to think about not if this will reverse, because it will. We need to think about when will it reverse? And that is a huge question. The most optimistic people I talk to say maybe in the second quarter of this year. Second quarter starts next month. And right now, there's not much sign that this is beginning to change, certainly not at the supermarket level. Time will tell. And our final contradiction, the contrast between the willingness to pay a fair price and the demand for sustainability. And I think this is about marketing. I think this is about how you talk to your customer. I think it's about which customer you deal with. How do you identify your customers? How do you select your customers? And I think it's this thing about selling the problem you solve, not the product. So the problem you solve as a processor is about sourcing, traceability, impact, sustainability, environmental responsibility, not about 320s. Because if you just sell a product, well, most days you're going to be able to buy that product at a lower price in Vietnam. So those are a mismatch. We're not seeing any easy answers here. We're going to see some of these problems resolved naturally in time, I think. Raw cashew nut prices and cashew kernels prices, that must resolve itself eventually. But it may well need some structural changes and rationalization in the industry before it's finally resolved. Some of them will be resolved in time. But some of them, and there I address African processors particularly and those that support them, some of them will need action. Action in marketing, action in storytelling, action in branding, action in promotion. But all of that must be based on a fundamental understanding of our customers. We need to know our customers better. Those are some of the mismatches, some of the talking points I'm anticipating over the next 2 weeks. I think we need to look at the crop progress in Cambodia. It's the key factor, it's the key balancing factor in supply and demand in 2023. We need to look at the Ivorian situation, the initial progress on that first crop, and the possibility of rain damage. Is there rain damage? If there is, how bad is it? We keep an eye on the farm gate price as a reflection of that. Need to look at the international RCN prices. Will we see some easing of prices from exporters, particularly looking at the export origins which are primarily focused on selling to Vietnamese processors? We can see in countries like Ghana, Benin particularly, that the Indian buyers will support that raw material, but whether or not Vietnamese processors will support material from Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, and elsewhere remains to be seen. We need to look at the impact of reduced processing capacity in Vietnam. The situation that we've just been talking about is not without impact on processors, and we know, I think, that there has been a reduction in the capacity, and that may be in different areas. It may be in the smaller outlying factories, it may be in some of the larger factories. We'll have to see what the impact of that is over time. Vietnamese cashew sector is predicting lower exports this year. I'm not sure demand will actually be lower this year. I think demand might be higher this year, but it would encourage a reduction in capacity, and that will have an impact on the availability of kernels. We need to keep an eye on China. So China, we would expect this year to return to a more normal import pattern. Last year, Chinese imports were pretty healthy, but they were still significantly down on the kind of levels we saw pre-pandemic. And finally, we need to take a look at US buyers. I think we probably will see activity in the US market in response to price first. And when we see that, it will be a big clue as to the next direction on cashew kernel prices. So they are not a very encouraging situation at the beginning of 2023. Production remains encouraging, but the market remains filled with these mismatches and contradictions. I've tried to give you my view on some of them. I hope you found it interesting, and I will pass you back to Blessing to see if there are any comments or questions. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim, for the presentation. Yes, we do have some questions here. Ladies and gentlemen, if you have any questions or need for clarification, there are two ways to go about it. You either drop it using your Q&A feature located on your screen, or use the raise hand feature, and then you will be called upon to ask your question directly to Jim. Without taking much time, Jim, the first question says, with the impressive growth in production from Cambodia, what are they doing differently that Africa can learn from? Should Africa's big producers be worried? Over to you, Jim.
Thanks, Blessing. What are they doing differently is that they developed high-yielding varieties, very high-yielding varieties. They're using quite a lot of inputs, and it is something that's happened over a significant period of time. So the development of high-yielding varieties, which was mainly developed by the private sector, the distribution of those seedlings, and the management of those trees with fertilizer, pesticides. It remains to be seen if this is a long-term strategy, but certainly there would be good learning in terms of the development of varieties. Now, I know that's quite common across African countries, and there have been some excellent varieties in Tanzania, Cote d'Ivoire, for example. More recently, I think there's work in Benin. But I think what is astounding in Cambodia is the implementation, mainly private sector implementation, that the advent of this research turned into production within less than 10 years. Should African big producers be worried? Well, if you're in the cashew business, you're probably always a little bit worried, but I don't think you should be worried about loss of demand. I think the underlying trends in demand are strong. I think at the moment we are in a difficult period. We're probably coming towards the beginning of the end of that, but I wouldn't be too worried. I would be proposing that work on post-harvest improvement in quality and definitely the development of origin processing continues to be a good idea. I wouldn't be concerned that their demand will be so low as to not absorb the production in the future.
Thank you very much, Jim. And the second question, you said Vietnam's export has declined. Does this mean consumption has increased in Vietnam?
No, not necessarily. Consumption in Vietnam is a very small proportion of the crop. Vietnam's export declined last year simply due to a lack of demand in importing countries. Mind you, that doesn't necessarily mean that consumption has declined either. What we're seeing is that Vietnam has a high share in markets like the United States. So last year, US imports were significantly down by 19%. So half of the decline in Vietnam's exports last year, I think it was actually 53% of the decline in Vietnam's exports were related to the loss of markets in the United States. That was mainly due to a decline in imports in the second half of the year. So it does mean that consumption has decreased outside, but it doesn't mean that consumption has increased. I think maybe this question might also be more related to India, where the increase in consumption in India and the reformulation of the market and government policy has caused exports to decline. So in India, we see that exports have declined dramatically over the last decade. And this has been related to a major increase in consumption of cashew kernels in India, which has been going on for decades now, but which really gathered pace 15 years ago and again now last year.
Thank you very much, Jim. The third question says, the decline in Vietnam's production, could it be related to Cambodia?
No, I don't think so. I think Vietnam's production had been declining for some time. Vietnam's production almost touched 500,000 tons at one point, and it has declined now where it's somewhere between 350 and 400,000 tons in a good year, and somewhere between 300 and 350 in a poor year, which is like this year, I guess. So I don't think it is related to Cambodia because it started well in advance. I think the decline in production in Vietnam was probably due to the fact that there were better things to do, more profitable things to do on those soils in those areas. And farmers in Vietnam are pretty smart and they reacted to that. And some of them took out their cashew trees and put in some other crops, cassava, rubber. Interestingly, we're seeing a little bit of a trend in Cambodia, a similar trend in Cambodia over the last 18 months or so. So that's one of the reasons why I say we need to keep a close eye on what's happening in Cambodia for the long-term production trend.
Thank you very much, Jim. The next question says, what do you think about a global law or standard for processors to abide by to avoid the 7 bias mixed signals?
Well, I think processors should engage more in marketing. They should embrace, what they call the decommoditization of cashew kernels. So start to treat it like a food, like an ingredient. Start to know the customer better, even if you're not dealing directly with the customer, even if you sell through an importer. to talk to the importer, to understand what the end buyer needs, to understand how to talk to buyers. And I think one of the things that I would say is that trade associations in the kernels exporting countries could have a big role to play in how they present their market. I mean, if one looks at the buyer's attitude, and I'm talking about the up the chain buyer, I'm not talking about the first importer, their attitude to Vietnam, essentially their feeling is that there's unending supply of cheap cashew kernels and that the prices can be low and lower. They look at Africa, they think cashew kernels probably going to be a higher price, but there's certain advantages on that. They have a rough idea of those advantages, but they don't really know what those advantages are. Why don't they know those things? Because nobody tells them. They don't know those things because we don't have the kind of marketing approach. There's no global marketing initiative to promote cashews. There's very few and very weak national initiatives to promote cashews. We as a sector don't tell our story very well. I'm not sure that there could be a global law or standard for that. In fact, I doubt there could, but I do think that it would be very constructive if we started to talk about this, and particularly if our trade associations, regulatory bodies in Africa, NCAN, ACA, CCA, the associations in Benin and elsewhere started to talk about marketing and promotions, and that will need a bit of support from governments too. So I think a lot of work needs to be done on this, but it's probably not law, but global practice, improvements, discussion could be really important. I mean, if the sector has come quite a long way. If you think 5 to 7 years ago, nobody even talked openly about the cashew market. The information was very difficult to find, but now it's much more available in all countries. So there's a lot of work to do in that area, to my mind. It's an interesting question. Could there be a standard for processors and marketing? In a way, maybe there is. I mean, if we talk about food safety, there are certainly standards. So maybe practice guides, organizations like the Global Cashew Council and trade associations to get involved, talking to their counterparts in the importing countries. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. We have some more questions here. And the next one says, will FOB kernel prices increase or decrease in the coming month?
I think my guess is that we might see a slight increase in FOB kernels prices in the coming months, but it might be toward the end of that 2 to 3 month period. I think the downside is very limited. I think that given where we are on pricing, it's pretty unlikely that prices will fall again. So I think, yeah, I'm more friendly toward the market, but I'm reluctant to make any big predictions on this one because we have had a relatively stable, low price market for some time now. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. I have another question here which says, will demand surpass supply in the West Africa this season?
Will demand surpass supply? I don't think so. I think the market is relatively balanced. I think we'll get a similar pattern to 2022. Almost all of the raw cashew nuts will move. There will be a small carry out. We don't see any huge increases in production. I think kernels exports will increase. So a relatively balanced situation, but there will not be a shortage. There will not be a situation where demand surpasses supply, in my opinion.
Thank you very much, Jim. There's another question here which says, what is your view on local demand in India? Will it grow during the coming year?
My view on local demand in India is essentially based on the people I've spoken to over the last 4 or 5 weeks. And generally, I get a pretty positive view on demand in India in the coming year. People are talking about good demand. They're talking about strong expectations for demand as the year goes on. So I think, yes, it will grow. probably not as quickly as it grew last year. Anecdotally, definitely, if I look at official reports, if I look at some of these agencies analyzing the Indian market, I see very strong reports, and they too believe that demand will grow this year. However, I think that some of their predictions, I read one predicting another 15% growth. I think that might be a little bit high, but yeah, definitely, I'm convinced that demand in India will grow again this year.
Thank you very much, Jim. I have exhausted all the questions that were dropped in the Q&A session, and there is nobody's hand raised to ask any question directly. So maybe before we bring the session to an end, what are your concluding remarks?
Well, I think when we look at these contradictions in the sector, I think we need to very carefully consider how do we tell the story of cashews, especially African cashews. But it also applies worldwide. We don't do a particularly good job of promoting this product, building buyers' awareness, and meeting buyers' needs. If we don't do that, we're going to be faced with continued volatility in the sector. And volatility is the most difficult thing to deal with, whether you're a processor, a farmer, and particularly if you're a buyer and a user of cashew kernels and you want to launch new products. So I think that addressing these mismatches, if not reversing them, if not fixing the underlying problems, at least to be able to explain them to customers, at least to be able to explain to customers why the raw material is costing more than the value of the kernels that they're trying to buy, why African kernels are more sustainable than kernels exported from elsewhere, why the arguments in favor of origin processing are so strong. We need to tell the story better. In the short term, I think this year we need to keep a close eye on production. Look at the big countries, look at Cambodia, look at Cote d'Ivoire. I think if we see any hint of renewed kernel buying, and I mean promotions as opposed to just taking short windows of cover, then we might be seeing the start of a recovery in kernels prices. I wouldn't be surprised if kernels prices finish the year higher than they are now. I wouldn't be surprised if we get to the middle of the year and we see that rise in kernels prices. Until we see some momentum behind that, it's going to continue to be difficult times for processors. And it's going to be a time when, if we get any difficult, unexpected news, that we will see a reaction in the market. So keep a close eye. It's not a time, in my opinion, for taking risks. It's a time to get on with business and take advantage of this period to, as I say, tell the cashew story better. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Jim, for another insightful presentation. And to our participants, we thank you for joining us. Once again, we also like to appreciate our partners and sponsors who have continually supported us to bring this session to you. We would communicate the next date to you in no short time. We ask that you subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you can always replay the sessions and follow us on our social media platforms. Without wasting much time, again, I'd like to announce that we have a date for the 17th ACA Annual Cashew Conference. The 17th ACA Annual Cashew Conference will take place from the 18th to the 21st of September 2023 in Dakar, Senegal. In the coming weeks, registration will start, and we ask that you take up the opportunity, register early, and have amazing discount. Without wasting much time again, and of course, to liberate you, we ask that you stay safe and see you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you.